You know how most stories tend to follow a typical narrative arc? If you've been in a writing class of any kind, or have heard of Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey, or have seen even a few mainstream movies, you'll be familiar with it. There's a clear beginning, middle, and end. The main character sets out on an adventure, they move triumphantly through a crisis, and then return home with the wisdom they've gained in going through the trial. These stories are neat and tidy. There's conflict, and then there's resolution. There's typically only one narrator, a person in power who gets the privilege of telling the story through their own lens. And these kinds of stories are also highly profitable. It's easy to sell tidy stories because people enjoy invitations to escape their own messy realities. But when all of our popular stories follow this pattern, whose stories are left out? How do they begin to shape the way we think our own lives should look? And how might that cultural narrative be damaging to us? How, too, do we make sense out of senseless narratives then, especially our own? You know, when you Google the word queer, the definition it comes back with is to spoil or ruin. And of course, queer has been used as a pejorative word in that sense for a long time, defining something that sits outside of the quote unquote norm. It's weird or strange. But you know what? Queers came along and were like, some things need to be spoiled. Some things need to be ruined, y'all. And perhaps the way we tell stories is one of the things that needs troubling. So hi, my name is Brandy, and I'm your very queer host. Welcome to This Plus That, a show about connecting the seemingly unconnectable and why it matters. In today's interview, I talk with Serena Chopra about what queer memoir has to do with rhizomes. I know Serena through the local Denver poetry and writing community, though she now lives in the Pacific Northwest as an assistant professor of creative writing at Seattle University. So, of course, she teaches, but she's also a writer, dancer, filmmaker, and visual and performance artist who has a Ph.D. in creative writing from the University of Denver. She's also a MacDowell Fellow, a Kundiman Fellow, and a Fulbright Scholar, and has 2 books, one called This Human and another called Ick, as well as 2 films, Dogana Chapti, which was an official selection at Frameline 43, the Oregon Documentary Film Festival, and Seattle Queer Film Festival, and Mother Ghosting. In October 2020, Serena co-directed No Place to Go, an artist-made queer haunted house with Kate Speer and Frankie Toan. And you'll hear us talk about that project in this episode, along with how Serena sees contradictions as the situation of life, how queer narratives don't have to be legible or easily consumable, the ways we repress our visionary intuitions in order to fit inside of institutions, the difference between arborescent versions of intelligence and rhizomatic versions of intelligence, Serena's story of growing up in ballet and later struggling to let herself go in dance and artistic practice, but how poetry eventually helped her understand modern dance and other more rhizomatic ways of being, the best advice she's ever had, which came from a dance teacher. And let me tell you, it's a doozy, by far my favorite piece of this conversation. And before we get going into the episode, though, at the very beginning, I just wanted to note that I'm talking to Serena about a mutual person we know named Sela Saderstrom and her book, Ideal Suggestions. I linked to it in the show notes, so you can find it there, which you're going to want to do by the time you're done listening. So let's get to it. Enjoy this conversation with Serena Chopra on queer memoir plus rhizomes. I'm so thrilled that you mentioned Sela's Ideal Suggestions. So yes. I actually, at some point, when I first got the book, I think it was on Instagram. I posted something. What did it say? I posted that feeling when you convert to a book's religion after merely reading its opening remarks. Like, yeah. I could just have her like an opening intro and be completely fine.
100%.
Like, she just like laid everything down in the intro, and that's all we really needed. The rest is just bonus. But okay, so I'm going to start there with 2 little pieces out of that. She's speaking about the act of divination and card reading. And she says, a bit of unsolicited advice. Choose the reader with the forked tongue, a reader able to straddle the border between inside and outside, who's able to move unburdened through the Ouroboros, dissolving the stitches, holding in tension the binary, and who can instead give way to the realms of uncertainty, simultaneity, contradiction, paradox, and parable. And then later, she tells this family story, and I want to read this whole bit because I think both are really relevant to your work and what we'll talk about today. And she says, once my sister wrote a story about the rapture and her freshman English composition class at the University of Southern Mississippi. It was graphic, a real page turner, much to the delight of the family who sat in complete attention, drinking coffee while she read it to us one Saturday morning with her professor's concerned red marks trooping on the typed pages. The following week, I read the story at school for show and tell, which mortified the school children, the teacher, and subsequently the principal, as well as some of the children's parents. Once home, I didn't get in trouble as I feared I might. My mother and grandmother laughed their deep, smoky laughs and thought the whole affair was marvelous. It wasn't that they believed in the kind of end of times rapture scenario my sister had written about. Rather, they believed a story could create the conditions for a dramatic reversal of fortune. That a story could upset order or subvert an authority figure or an institution. They loved the gamble lurking inside of a reading. So I first, especially because of that first quote about sort of crossing the border, being able to cross borders and be in complexity and nuance and contradiction and paradox and all of that, I wanted to start with maybe a bit of a personal reflection of wondering where you're holding tensions and contradictions in your life right now, or what borders you feel like you're currently straddling.
That's a great question. I feel that it's not a particular thing. For me, borders and contradiction and paradox are kind of just the way everything is. Maybe it's because I'm an Aquarius. I don't know, but everything always seems to have it seems to avoid the binary, seems to have you can have like a really great person, a really great figure, but they are also human. And so they also are flawed and they have terrible traits to them too. Right. Mm-hmm. And so this idea of contradiction and paradox for me is just kind of the situation of life. I mean, you have the idea that creation breeds destruction, destruction breeds creation. For me, these things are always in tension. Particularly when I'm thinking about queer poetic memoir. For me, what queerness does is it possesses this kind of contradiction and paradox. It legitimizes it, and it says it's okay to not have to smooth it out, to not say, well, let's make a moral out of this story, or let's make a linear narrative out of this, or let's make something that makes meaning, that makes value for some kind of external logic, reason, or institution, right? Like, I don't need to be responsible for making my story feel legible or valuable to some economies outside of my own experience, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think what happens a lot in these sort of traditional canonized literary structures or literary forms is that the goal of the narrative is to produce a kind of beginning, middle, and end where the middle and the end work as a kind of overcoming resolution pattern, right? So that the problem of the beginning becomes understandable, legible, reconcilable, right? And essentially binary, right? Went from good to bad.
Yeah. Sort of like there's that piece you referred me to, that's the refusal of closure.
Yes. Lynn Virginian's The Rejection of Closure. Right. Exactly.
Yes. Rejection. Yeah.
Right. And so, in these traditional narrative forms, there's this drive to close things up, to make things neat and tidy, to avoid the paradox and the contradiction. And what's so brilliant for me about Sela's text, as you said, it's sort of like this Bible-like book for me, in that it says it's okay to have a queer story. And by queer, I mean, in the most broad sense, oblique, or, non-normative or non-dominant. But I feel like when we use the words non-dominant and non-normative, we're reinstating that binary hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
And so instead, I like to think about things as being queered or not queered, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the things that are queered are oftentimes approached in an effort to straighten them, right? This is a concept that comes from Sarah Ahmed's book, Queer Phenomenology.
Mm-hmm.
When she asks us, when we see something queer, how do we approach it? Do we approach it with a gesture of straightening it into something legible that we can understand and identify and easily consume? Or do we allow it to be its own queerness? And do we approach it with wonder? Do we approach it with curiosity, uncertainty, and find ourselves inside of, as Sila would call, the guts of the flux of that paradox, that contradiction, that multiplicity? And so my work with Queer Poetic Memoir says, listen, life is absurd, and we all have our queer stories. Why are we working so damn hard to make them not queer?
Mm-hmm.
To make them legible, to make them something easily consumable? And so for me, queer narrative is all about indulging in the paradox, indulging in the contradiction, indulging in the uncertainty, and the gamble of entering into something that may not give you a singular answer or solution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And part of what happened for me, I think, when I started reading Sila's work, and especially that introduction, was, I grew up in the South, and I have this sort of whole like swimming in like cultural Christianity, and like later in adulthood, or sort of early, or like, let's say like late high school, I started getting involved in faith kinds of things. And so I engaged in that, and then later came out when I was around 27, and in the work of disentangling a bunch of the things that I had been taught about queerness took probably about a decade to really contend with. And I think I hadn't really realized it, but I think in the sort of work that I think is a normal human evolutionary sort of development cycle, which is the, like, you learn a thing and then you completely rebel against that thing. And then at some point you sort of reach a maturity, if we're talking linearly, which is not really how we experience this, but at some point you learn to kind of integrate what works for you and, leave out what didn't. But I hadn't realized, I think, before reading Sila, that part of what happened for me in disentangling those things and what I believed about like the mystery and whatever was behind all of, existence or what have you, was also sort of ditching my Southernness. And I think especially when I hear Sila talk, to hear someone who is like deep Southern, uses like a language of mystery and faith that feels so good to me, because she's found a way to incorporate that in her world and be queer and be a tarot reader and a diviner and all of those things. And it was like, for the first time, I had permission to go, oh, your whole history can fit. And it doesn't have to suit a particular narrative. It's okay that someone can't understand that you can both still have some of those sort of mystery faith kinds of things, and also really fucking love being queer and being Southern and talking about witches and, all of those things. It was like upsetting that order. Right. So that's what happened for me, I think, when I read her work.
Yeah. 100%. I think Sila's all about that. I think there's a line in there of the second quote that you read that talks about dissolving the stitches, right?
Mm-hmm.
Rather than trying to neatly bring these things together, accepting their messiness and their disarray. And she also says in the chapter, right, that disarray does not mean a lack of organization, right? Or order, a lack of order, I think is the word.
Mm-hmm.
And what that means to suggest is, I think, that order is oftentimes an external regulation, right? What do we think of as something that's ordered versus something that's in disarray, right? But so something that is so queer oftentimes seems unordered to non-queer, right? To the non-queer. But just because it's not ordered in that way, just because it's a disarray according to that, doesn't mean that it doesn't have a kind of order to it, right? And a kind of very like potent and poignant order to it, right? Which I think is where Sila really is. Sila, you know, not only am I a great admirer of her work, but she was my mentor at the University of Denver, where I learned to write and think with her. She also married my wife and I, so she also has a strong sort of spiritual place in our life. But at the university, she talked a lot about what it meant to be a visionary inside of the institution. And a lot of that pedagogy is exactly how she thinks about being in the world too, and was very helpful for me to understand how do I both criticize an institution and imagine through it and allow my own narratives to be empowered by it and inside of it. Right. So the question of how to be a visionary inside the institution is always in my mind. And by the institution, we can talk about the university, but literally every level of institutionalization. And so when we're thinking about our own stories and the complexity of those, right, the question can also then be, in what ways have we repressed our visionary intuitions in order to fit inside of an institution? And so it's really a balancing between participating inside of and also participating in excess of or outside of, which is also simply the definition of queerness. Excess, obliqueness.
Yeah, I feel like what you're describing also. So in looking up, because what I think you want to try and tie in here is the idea of rhizomatic, or, you know, rhizomes to queer memoir and narrative, right? And I, in sort of digging across the internet for this conversation, found two French philosophers who use those terms to mean theory and research that allows for multiple non-hierarchical entry and exit points in data representation and interpretation. And that's sort of what I hear you saying. And so when I think of a rhizome, which is like an example, is maybe like, so they're root things. So like a ginger root, perhaps. And I love what you said a second ago about how, you know, it doesn't mean a lack of disorder, or it doesn't mean a lack of order, I guess. And so when you look at a piece of ginger or turmeric or something, it looks pretty all over the place, but it doesn't mean there's some sort of like underlying natural order to that also. So how do you feel like you bring that sort of philosophy into the work that you do in writing and performance, right? You do dance as well, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. Right. So I think you were referencing Deleuze and Guattari's 1,000 Plateaus, where they talk about the rhizome versus the arborescent. And yeah, that's the definition of it. But very simply, what Deleuze and Guattari are doing here is thinking about the way, so thinking about the natural world, you have, in this sort of dichotomy that they're drawing up, you have an arborescent tree and you have a rhizomic tree. An arborescent tree, or an arborescent model of intelligence, is when all of the information is going through a singular centralized intelligence, right? A centralized kind of universe. We can think about intelligence, a centralized institution. And we can think about this as, most broadly, maybe like capitalism, right? Everything everything that we're doing is always kind of moving towards these larger capital gains or processes. On the other hand, a rhizome or the rhizomic model of intelligence has multiple intelligences, multiple centers of meaning making, and multiple and simultaneous centers of intelligence and meaning making. So they're happening at the same time, and there's a number of them happening, and they're not all going to a certain centralized capacity of meaning or centralized unit of memory or history or whatever it is. Right. So, another really interesting thing about the rhizome and the arborescent is that the arborescent moves horizontally, and the arborescent is often thought of to move vertically. So thinking about the dynamic between the horizontal and the vertical, and I'll get back to that in just a second. And third, right, yes, ginger roots, turmeric. In fact, the largest living organism on the planet, an aspen tree, is a rhizome. And so rhizomes have this immense capacity to transmit a lot of information across great vast distances in ways that are not even completely understood, right? Aspen trees, down I-70 or wherever you are around aspen trees, can transmit, if there's a disease on one end of the family, they can send information, miles away to receive nutrients and to also warn of impending disease, right? And so rhizomes have this capacity to communicate. They move horizontally, and they have multiple and simultaneous intelligences. This is very similar to what Sila is talking about when she's talking about divinatory poetics, right? In fact, she says participation, what she calls reading and writing, participation happens in the membranous precincts between the multiple bodies and the larger rhizomic field of resonance. Okay. And what she means here is that within any given narrative situation, right? She also cites C.D. Wright talking about narrative is. We are always inside of narrative. We are never not inside of narrative, right? And so we are constantly always in context or in, a relationship to many other things happening at once, many other intelligences happening at once.
That's like I'm thinking back to the queer phenomenology, where she's talking about, because we're constantly in that, using other things to orient ourselves in the world. Yes,
exactly. 100%. That's exactly what she's saying, right? Like, we're always in context to others, right? And so we kind of map, like, narrative is mapped onto us in a really rhizomic way, right? Narrative isn't linear. It's not singular, even though we sort of press it into these, linear and singular patterns. And the brilliance of Sila's text is that she takes, this rhizomic, multiple simultaneous intelligences, and notes that what we see and how we see it, what is sounded and unsounded in any given narrative moment, delivers information to us in the same way that a tarot reading might deliver information to us. Right. So that when we are reading a spread of cards in tarot and divination, right, we see a number of colors, images, patterns, figures, whatever it is, right, even language. And what we read from that spread is the information that we most need to know. Right? It's our subconscious turning on. It's a blueprint. Sila calls it a blueprint for our subconscious. It is lit with information. So even though we are constantly inside these vast narrative events, right, what we see tells us about ourselves, about what we tend to see in the world, about what we desire to see in the world, about what we imagine from the world. Right. So that narrative becomes a kind of multiple and simultaneous structure. So rather than thinking about narrative as like a point A to point B to point C, D, etc., thinking about narrative as a multiply intelligenced, simultaneous simultaneously informed structure. Right. That is in relationship, that wherein all the elements inside of it are in a kind of divine relationship to each other, meaning that the way that they are connected, the way that they are energetically placed around each other imitates our actual experience of living inside of narrative. So that when a reader enters into the text, what the reader sees from the text tells them not more about the narrative that they're reading, but more about themselves. What do they divine from a text, right? What is important for them, so that we're creating narrative structures that imitate our lived experience in the world inside of narrative.
It's like a type of bibliomancy.
Yeah, it is. It's exactly bibliomancy, 100%.
Yeah.
And that's an exercise I do a lot with my students when we explore Sela's text. But creating texts that are rhizomic. And the reason I bring the rhizome and queer poetic memoir together is because the form of the rhizome, this horizontal spreading structure, doesn't have the limitations and the expectations that an arborescent or vertical structure has. When we're thinking about memoir or narrative as trying to accelerate or erect itself up to a climax from which it then, resolves. The expectation of that body is very forward moving, very singularly oriented towards like a singular final goal. And is processing itself in a linear way, right? Whereas, and all of this is sort of in the vertical momentum of the narrative, right? The sort of like 3-act plot starts. I'm trying to describe this sensation verbally, but it's like, if you haven't seen it before, it's like a hill, right? It begins at the bottom of the hill, it moves up towards the climax, and then the resolution is the denouement is the descent from that hill. Post-structuralist feminists have called this structure, masculine, part of the masculine discourse. It in fact does resemble a kind of like erection and, satisfaction of a sort of like phallic entity. And so the rhizome itself offers a different model that is horizontal. It's sort of leaky. It's moving in multiple different directions at once. It has multiple intelligences. It's holding a lot of otherness that is not its singular motivation or singular intelligence. It has a lot of other intelligences inside of it, including the readers, right? When the reader enters this text, they're overlaying their own desire and imagination through it. And so the rhizomic text is a text, as Banu Kapil articulates in her book, Ban and Banui, the rhizomic text is a text that wants to lay down, that desires to lay down, that refuses to stand up. Right. And by standing up, what I mean is appearing as a legible entity in some sort of consumable meaning-making market.
Yeah, I was going to say, to me, like I'm hearing all of that and also feeling the sense of like a refusal to be contained also.
Yes.
That it's like an act of just taking up more space.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Taking up space, refusing to be contained, and to be contained by what? I mean, there's many answers, but I think foremost for me, it's the refusal to be contained by the sort of capital colonial logics and orders that create binaries, that create margins and then victimize them, that create, classes and hierarchies, right? It's a refusal to participate in those economies, those vertical economies, those hierarchical economies, those economies of erecting oneself out of circumstances that have so oppressed and harmed them, right?
Mm-hmm.
So another way to think about this is like, Banu Kapil's book, Bon and Bon Oui, is talking about the race riots in London and the ways in which certain narratives just literally cannot stand, right, in these forms, right? Like, how do you make sense out of a senseless narrative?
Mm-hmm.
How do you make sense out of such violence and hatred?
Mm-hmm.
And so queer poetic memoir, I think, when it takes on a rhizomic modality, refuses to legitimize itself by erasing itself, refuses to say, I'm going to stand up when what I really need to do is lie down, right? It refuses to heal itself when it is not, in fact, healed. It refuses to say, because I've overcome this, everybody has overcome this. It continues to acknowledge that these are ongoing narratives, that they are continuing to spread, right? And that the intelligence around them is gathering. Right? And a really beautiful, for me, one of the most beautiful parts about thinking about a rhizome is that it happens underground. Most of it happens underground. We see surfacing, but most of it happens beneath the surface. And what has happened in these sort of arborescent vertical narratives that create, dominant versus non-dominant, right, is that there is the creation of a margins. And not only is there a creation of the margins, but the margins becomes disempowered and victimized, right? We learn that the goal is to escape the margins, is to get into the capital colonial, is to stand up and be a part of the systems of oppression, right? Yeah. But that's not the answer. The answer is to turn back to the quote unquote margins, to turn back to the obliqueness, to look back into the queerness and to say what there can be empowered. How can I tell my narrative from that point, from the rhizome?
Yeah, I'm people listening to the podcast won't be able to see this, but I'm sort of starting to tear up, mostly because yesterday I filmed a trailer for this podcast with a group of friends, and a lot of, the work of that is them trying to get me to tell the very personal story of why this matters to me. And part of that was the story about how much of my life I have spent sort of going, here I am, here I am, here I am, and feeling rejection because I didn't necessarily fit a narrative. And sometimes, honestly, in queer spaces. But really, and I think part of that is because we, in fleeing dominant culture, quote unquote, for using that sort of binary, we sort of erect it's like that. We keep sort of trying to assimilate to that same model. Right. And so I think I experienced that repeatedly and in and outside of queer community so many times in my life. And after so much rejection of going, I don't look like this thing. And it was such a lonely, isolating experience. And this project and some of the work I've been doing recently feels like the first time that I finally just went, okay, well, I'm just going to make my own way, which is the rhizome. If I'm just going to go back and claim the underground, because that's the only place I know how to operate. And I'm not going to see it anymore as, well, I can't do X, Y, and Z, so I guess I'll just live this sort of like half life. It actually feels like a more full life to go, I'm turning back to that margin and going, this is actually a space of power. And so I would love to hear also, like, I don't know if you have if you could reflect any experiences like that in your life also, or like why this is so personal to you, why you feel like so much of your work is dedicated toward this sort of, toppling, if we're going to use that vertical image again, like toppling that kind of narrative and laying down instead, like a rhizome.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's one, I guess I haven't fully processed myself.
Well, I mean, to a lot of your points, it's not a clean narrative.
True.
I don't expect something that just in a few sentences describes your entire experience, but I do love hearing why you can even like conjecture why this sort of work became really meaningful and put like a direction, almost like, like Sela once in a reading to me, when she pulled cards for me, said, like the way she does it, you were sort of describing things earlier. It's like pulling cards is a way of contextualizing the flux,
Yes.
And so it's like a book. Like it's like a book
Yes.
contextualizes whatever narrative or story that the reader is engaging in. And so that's simply what I'm doing, is asking you I'm giving you a little container to say, if you could conjecture some sort of story of why you think that this has been such a personal thing to you.
Yeah, this is great. I think it's a number of simultaneous things. And for me, it happened in probably became most apparent to me in once I started in academia as an undergrad student, all the way through my doctorate program, and even into, my work life. There is always this sort of like there's this external expectation of how an academic should and needs to be. And that filters into one's psyche in really powerful and upsetting ways. I'm a classically trained ballerina, and I grew up in a very like controlled body, right? The body had its performance had a very certain way to be, and to hold itself and to posture itself. And the expectations on that, ranging from gender to weight to just the sort of sculpting of the body was so firm. When I got to undergrad, I was there on a dance scholarship, and they asked me to, like, part of my dance scholarship is I had to take dance classes all the time. I was a dance major, et cetera. And I had to take all these modern dance classes. And the ballerina me was definitely not into rolling around on the floor and dropping low. And I really, really struggled with letting go. I struggled so much that I dropped the major for a quarter or a semester or two. And I filled my classes with poetry classes. I don't know why. I just went into poetry. And
that sounds to me something like you were moving from something that was very bound to something that was very unbound.
But I had no idea. I really never knew. I mean, I had read like high school poetry, and I was like, I guess I'll take a poetry class.
Yeah.
And then I got into these poetry classes, and I learned about modernism and the romantics and postmodernism and modern art. It just like all these things. And I found them so exciting. And then I went back to dance, and I was like, yeah, let's do modern dance. I get it. I get it. It's not about perfection and performing for something expected. It's about feeling yourself and your own momentum. And in fact, the best advice I ever got from any teacher I've ever had was from a dance teacher in college, Gabriel Masson. And he told me, if you keep thinking about the steps, you're going to miss the momentum. And I think about that all the time now. Whoa. Right? Like, if I'm always thinking about the steps, I'm going to miss the life of it all. Right? And so, I don't know, just everything clicked for me in that moment. And it changed the way I approached my education. I just realized I was trying to live up to all these steps, and none of them actually meant very much to me. My life was not in motion with it. And so I started, experimenting in all these ways artistically, through dance and film and writing. And I just really found momentum, and I wrote it. But the consequence to finding your own momentum and still being inside of the institution is that the institution hates you having your own momentum. And so then I was like this young queer artist, like so excited to be a part of the world. And then I just kept running into walls with professors who wanted my work to be more like a straight white dude's work. I even had a professor take this really beautiful, hyper queer feminist work and move it into these like little paragraphs in the center of the page. I just felt like this professor had taken my work and put it in a prison cell. And so where do I always, where am I coming up? against, you talked about this contradiction. This is like a huge moment for me when I'm coming up against this art. I'm supposed to be in art school. I'm supposed to be in graduate school, creating art. And yet I'm being told that this is not the right way to do it.
Right. Because there's only one right way to be a writer, or an artist, a dancer, all of those things.
Exactly. And so I realized very quickly how much extra work it takes BIPOC, queer, female identified writers and artists to be artists, how much more legitimization it takes, right? Like if I really wanted to be doing this work, I was not going to get any sort of legitimization or acceptance from the professors who I admired and who I wanted to work with. Right. Because they knew poetry and there was one way of being a poet. And so I came up a lot against this kind of energy. Then when I became a professor, I felt very deeply that it was so, so important. Part of my pedagogy to not focus on what students are doing wrong, how they aren't writing correctly, but to look at the ways in which they are empowering their narrative and to help them empower it further in those ways. And so I sort of forget your first question here, but I remember thinking about it. Like what's really meaningful to me in this work is that I let other people know that they don't have any other external body to live up to. And I think this is really important for queers generally, and for BIPOC writers generally and artists generally, because for so long we have been trained to write like cis white men. And we've been told that's the only way to make it big. And it's not true. And not only is it not true, it's really participating in the oppression and the erasure of our stories, right? We do not have to perform in the ways that they're asking us to perform.
Yeah.
We can perform however we want to perform. If I write an essay and it turns into a poem and then it turns into a film and I call that a single piece, that's a single piece. And that's my art.
Yeah, you Beyonce'd it.
Yes, and don't you dare tell me it's not, right? And so for me, it's really important to empower other people to recognize that they don't have to tell their stories in any given way. That a story is like Sila says, writing. In writing a story, you are also the reader of your story. And as being the reader of your story, you are divining something about yourself. You are not living up for some sort of external, right? Find your own, find the momentum. Don't think about the steps, but be in the momentum of your story. Where does it take you?
Yeah. I feel like what is a lifetime of things to say about all of that. I think first I've been thinking about, as you've been saying, sort of alternative methods of communication, that rhizomes go underground and that sort of thing. And thinking about how often I know myself and queer narrative or artists have to find those alternative forms of communication. In these days and times, I always sort of joke about like what a loss like old Tumblr was, because that sort of felt like a queer like rhizome. Like it was a place where we found to share things that wasn't really acceptable, or it was our own way of like reaching out. Again, that sort of phenomenology, like we're going to orient to these other folks that we see. But I think too, the way that, like you said, BIPOC or queer or female identified marginalized folks have to sort of go, if you're not going to give me the space to do what I want to do, or sort of contain it in a way that doesn't feel true to who I am, I'm going to self-publish, or I'm going to, I'll find alternative ways to put my work out into the world. And so if it's like going out in the street and doing it in the street, or, for me, that was, okay, well, I'm probably not going to get a book published anytime soon, but I'm just going to like write my own newsletter, so that was like one way I was like, okay, well, I'm going to find an alternative method to put my stuff out in the world. And then the other thing I think, especially, so my past history was branding and marketing stuff. So I've been sort of like feels very like a contained way of doing story. But so much of my life has been spent worrying about like how you quote unquote, make it big and helping other people do that. And number one, a lifetime of helping other people do that and not myself, and usually straight white men, and them making a lot of money. And, so in the last like year or two, I've sort of started going, I just no longer want to give my energy and effort and brilliance to, these other folks. Like, I think I actually deserve doing that for myself also. But I think there's also something to sort of rejecting the narrative that I don't need your audience. I'm not actually interested in your audience. Like, your idea of whatever making it big is doesn't apply to me. And when you start actually leaning into the stuff that gets you excited and is sort of queering that narrative, that your audience finds you, it's really all that you need. And it sort of builds that underground rhizomic network of, well, we're going to reclaim this space and tell the stories that we need to tell. And that's really all we need to be concerned about. Like, that we don't have to meet your idea of, whatever big is, or just the amount of numbers that you think are important, or, the quantity of followers, or whatever those things are, like all the ways that I think we all sort of have to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't really see the point of trying to make myself legible to people who don't want to see me as legible. Like, it's just, I'm not going to put in all that effort to write a story, to give my memoir to somebody who's just not going to make an effort on their end to understand or to come into, right? It's that question of approaching queerness again that Sarah Ahmed gives us. When you as a reader are given a queer story, do you demand that it be more straight, that it be more legible for you? Or do you approach it as like something that's queer and maybe illegible to the current economies of meaning that right? And so I challenge everybody to say, when you approach something that you don't quite understand, is your first reaction to put it into economies of meaning that you already know, to straighten it? Or do you approach it with curiosity and allow it to shift you as well? Right? Because true integration, if we're really thinking about what is integration and, how do we really, center the margins is a really big term right now, right? Integration doesn't mean that like the margins have to like change themselves to fit inside. Right? It actually means that when the margins enter a space, that everything in the space shifts. Everything shifts, right? It's integrated into, right, or along with the dominant organism, right? And so the what is considered dominant also has to change, right? As it approaches queerness, it too must be queered, right? And so also queerness has the potential not only to constantly shift and change that which is in its context, in its constellation, but that it's always doing that act. It's not just doing it one time and then we're good, right? Queerness always is shifting and changing. It's as Jose Munez says, a kind of an act of the horizon, right? Queerness is always a futurity. It's never the here and now. As soon as it becomes the here and now, it's really no longer queer, right? And so queerness is kind of this goal of movement, of being inside the guts of the flux, of allowing ourselves to participate in narratives of futurity, and not just narratives that replicate our present moment.
Yeah. And now that you brought up space also, I'm reminded that one of the other things I think that you have mashed together in your work is the idea of queerness and horror.
Yeah.
And I'd love to hear so what was that, a year and a half ago, maybe you collaborated with some folks to create a queer haunted house. Can you talk about that? Yeah, I'd love to hear how it went, what the sort of driving force behind that was.
Yeah, I collaborated with Speer and Frankie Toan, and Kate is a dancer, choreographer, performance artist, theater person, and Frankie is a visual artist, mostly known for their plush sculptures. Really great work. Both of these artists are phenomenal, but Frankie's idea was to create a queer haunted house based off of the lesbian killjoy. So it was called feminist killjoy, lesbian killjoy haunted house. Happened in Pittsburgh. Oh, I might need to get those details correct.
All right.
But anyways, Frankie came to Kate with an idea, and then Kate invited me to the project. And the goal was to make an immersive theater production that explored the horror of the binary, right? The ways in which binary constructions become settings of fear for certain bodies, right? Mm-hmm. So not being able to, I think the most basic example or the most straightforward example would be like a trans body having to choose between woman and man, gender-based restrooms or gender-based anything, right? Mm-hmm. But thinking about how this happens to a lot of queered bodies, right? How, for myself, for example, having to choose between traditional, very important traditional Indian values and being an American child of the 1990s, right? Like there's a lot of mixed messages, and so so queer individuals or oblique individuals who don't fit neatly into the sort of cultural capital narratives find themselves oftentimes in these places of horror, and horror as being defined as like being fearful of something external, sure, but we were very much interested in the internal fear. What happens on the inside? What shifts happen to a queer body when they are in heightened states of anxiety? And so trying to translate that into a haunted house experience, not as a way to re-traumatize, we were very careful not to do that, but as a way to explore the more conceptual aspects of dealing with this kind of trauma and fear.
Mm-hmm. Well, what beautiful, amazing things are you working on currently? Because I think I saw that you've also been awarded a MacDowell Fellowship.
Yeah, I got a MacDowell. And so I'm working on a book I've been working on for a while now, called Dayavati of Mercy. It is a book about my family history. It begins, it's a book in 4 parts, a poetic memoir in 4 parts, beginning in Patiala, Punjab, with my grandmother who was born there and married at age 14 to my grandfather into a pretty abusive home, a very abusive home. She was brutalized, beaten. Her first son was taken from her. She tried to kill herself 3 times. And so it traces her life story and then traces my father growing up and witnessing this and also being the victim of abuse, and then follows his immigration to the United States, whereupon he receives the abuse of racism, racial violence in America, and it sort of traces his migration from the East Coast from India to the East Coast to the West, the prairie in the West where I grew up in Colorado. And the 4th part of the book briefly investigates the sort of domestic violence that I experienced as a child as well. But culminates in a final section where my father is bringing his father, who has been severely injured in India, bringing him to America, where he lived with us for 10 years and nursing him back to health. And then that story is parallel to after my father had his heart attack, the ways that I was nursing him, and then really contemplating how we build up. Is it resilience? Is it sacrifice? What is it that allows us to care for people who have so deeply harmed us? How do we, where do we find inside of us? What kind of love inside of us draws us to care for people who have abused us and hurt us?
Mm-hmm.
And so overall, I think the book is also a commentary on, there's a lot of eco-commentary, the destruction of the Great Plains in Colorado and the destruction of the plains in Maharashtra, India, where my grandfather had a construction company that really wrecked a lot of those prairies out there. So thinking also about the resilience of the prairie through these kinds of mass constructions, and then investigating that on a larger social level, which is like, what do we do with our history of racism? What do we do with our history of violence and abuse? How do we see nurture inside of that, or resilience, without putting any judgment on any of these concepts? It's a contemplation of what is resilience, what is nurturing, what is love after violence.
It also sounds sort of like thinking about how the internal state affects the external world, like how we wreak havoc externally when our internal state is in such, disarray. And I love too, it's just sort of going back to Sila again, that, she, I think, often talks about how healing happens in all directions. Yeah. And I feel like it's not really lost on me that I think so many queer folks, queer bodies often are using their lived experience to do the work of healing generational trauma. And so I'm hearing you sort of recount what sounds like a linear story, the 4 acts, but is actually you also working backward through all of your family time and history, and connecting that to present moment and our own, ecological destruction and that sort of thing. So I love that sort of weaving in and out, and sort of also disrupting time and healing work and queerness and all of those things combined.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, you said it gorgeously. That's correct.
Yeah. Well, is there anything we didn't cover today that you would love to make sure you say to the people?
No, I don't think so. I think that was really lovely. And thank you for letting me speak today and listening and being in conversation together.
Of course. I wish we could do more. There's truly probably 20 things I wish I could still drop in, but yeah, thank you for your time. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the work that you do in the world to engage rhizomatically and tell a queer narrative and disrupt all of those stories.
Thank you, Brandy. Thank you so much for doing this work. Such a cool podcast.
Thank you. Okay. Y'all can find Serena online at serenachopra.com. Links to show notes and everything we talked about are on my site as usual at thisplusthat.com/episodes. Thanks to the team at Upfire Digital for the audio processing. They're amazing. I love y'all. You can find them online at upfiredigital.com. All of my music is by the folks at slip.stream. Find them online at that same address. And I do these interviews from my home on the native land of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho people. And I'm still working on doing this well. This is what's referred to as a land acknowledgement, recognizing that really land and property is, land doesn't belong to anyone and property is an illusion. I don't own land. No one owns land. The land and I and all of us belong to each other. in community. And I think Indigenous people are our future and Black women and all sorts of folks who are just doing incredible work to teach us how to better live in community and to be in relationship with each other and the land and every creature on this planet. So in any case, you can otherwise find me online at thisplusThat.com and of course on This Plus That Pod across social media. Right now I'm only on Twitter and Instagram really. And more importantly, if you're a plus kind of person and you love this stuff as much as I do, like the mashing together of queer memoir and narratives and rhizomes, then I want you to also sign up for my newsletter. You can do so on my site. In it, you're going to get inside peeks at important connections that I'm making at intersections of other seemingly unconnected ideas, usually a lot of essay and things that I'm processing in my own life. And you'll also see podcast announcements so you never miss a show when it drops, additional commentary and behind the scenes thoughts from me beyond these conversations, plus curated links to my other favorite recent idea mashing people in media. It's also the only other place I share recommended reading and listening related to each show, and where I let you know if you can find me on other things. So like recently, I was just interviewed by Nancy Norbeck of the Follow Your Curiosity podcast. And we talked a lot about aliveness, which is a concept I learned from Andreas Weber, who was my last guest on the podcast. So sign up for the newsletter on my site there, of course, at thisplusThat.com. And yeah, the other things that really help me out are when you rate, review, and subscribe. You hear so many podcast people tell you that, but it's so true. When you rate the show 5 stars, when you submit a review that's very kind and says why this has meant something to you, and then when you subscribe so you make sure to never miss a show, all of those things are things that help me and other podcasters really get the word out about our show and rise in the rankings and do things that help us promote this work. And it really doesn't cost anything of you, right? Because for now, this is just a total labor of love for me. I'm not making money from this, even though I really hope to in the future in a way that's hopefully mutually beneficial for you. And, even then, when you can't afford to, engage financially with me, I'm so grateful for and benefit so much from the free of charge work of literally just rating, reviewing, and subscribing. So thank you for not only doing that, but also sharing this show with other people that will find it meaningful. I love that. I love hearing when you get so excited and you've shared it with all of your friends. So thank you for it. And thanks for listening to this conversation between myself and Serena. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and I can't wait to talk to you next time.